Final speaker for the morning is Kristina Thayer. She is the Integrated Risk Information System Division Director at the APA, and her talk is entitled Approaches to Integrating Evidence from Animal and Human Studies in Chemical Assessments.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here. So, true confession, I've been at EPA for 7 months. Prior to that, I was at NTP. So sorry to sort of miss overlapping with Brian and Allison. I guess we overlapped for a few months. But EPA and NTP have a very sort of close relationship. So.
And we miss you.
Yeah. I miss you. But I love my job. But I miss you. Okay. So, and also, I'm getting old. I did something to my neck. I'm normally a very animated speaker, so I'm feeling a little stiff. Anyway, okay, so I just want to give you a little bit of context about the IRIS program. It's sort of a lightning rod of controversy. The Integrated Risk Information System, we do chemical assessments. We live in the Office of Research Development, so we do the technical assessments that underpin regulatory decisions. We were created in 1985 because there was a proliferation of different programs within the agency working on the same chemicals, coming up with different numbers. And that made nobody happy. So IRIS assessments contribute to a lot of decisions made within EPA, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the brand new Toxic Substances Control Act, which was passed last year with bipartisan support that sort of oversees a lot of chemicals and commerce. What we do is comprehensive assessments of hazard, and we produce toxicity values. On my next slide, I'm going to explain a little bit more what they are. We are the only federal program that produces these values for both cancer and non-cancer. So, for example, just a little bit of context, if you know anything about NTP, they produce hazard assessments, their literature analysis unit. So we do that, but then we also provide these toxicity values. So that's sort of one of the linkages in how we're unique. Our assessments undergo a rigorous multi-step review process with opportunities for public comment, otherwise known as just, it's hideous. Now, it takes probably about 2 years. Agency review, interagency review, numerous public comments, responding to public comments. Yeah, I think 2 years is optimistic. So because of this, we're sort of considered tier 1, like in terms of source of chemical assessment information, because it's even though it's painful, because it's such a rigorous peer review process, we are the top-notch producers. So our assessments, as I mentioned, they are sort of the technical assessments that underpin decision making. So they don't really do anything unless a program office would combine it with information about exposure, a cost of cleanup, and sort of make a decision on it. So, in brief, some of the toxicity value definitions, reference dose or concentration, this would be for non-cancer. It's an estimate spanning an uncertainty about an order of magnitude of a daily oral or inhalation exposure to a human population that's not thought to be with risk. So that would include consideration of sensitive subgroups. Oral slope factor is for cancer. It would be the increased cancer risk from oral exposures to a dose of 1 mg per kg per day for a lifetime. Inhalation unit risk is also sort of a cancer value. It's a risk from inhalation exposure to a concentration of 1 microgram per cubic meter for a lifetime. So IRIS, you're going to hear me in my talk a lot about how we try to integrate across human and animal evidence, and that's because IRIS gets the chemicals with large evidence bases, the zombies, the undeads, the arsenics, the formaldehyde. And so, in those cases where you have a lot of traditional evidence, by that I mean toxicology or epidemiology studies, then we tend not to dig down too much into the in vitro or the modeled evidence. But I would say that as a program, as a community within environmental health, as an agency, and in particular in my program, we are interested in expanding beyond this. And so having sort of a repository of approaches to deal with more of the data poor chemicals. And so if you look in this definition, I'm not going to spend much time on it, but in Allison's slide, oops, I went the wrong way. You see NOEL, LOEL, benchmark doses. In the context of many IRIS assessments, these would be derived from animal toxicology studies. But increasingly, we're very interested in thinking about sort of the in vitro systems or other approaches to try to come up with these values. And I'll just sort of throw out there that I think a lot of the sort of the ground truthing that's been done might be sort of trying to align an in vitro estimate with maybe a single study. And so within the IRIS program, where we do these very comprehensive literature-based analysis, we have the opportunity to sort of look at those kind of applications and seeing whether perhaps a benchmark dose from that is protective of many hazards across life stages. So we use systematic review methods to do the assessments. I think this was touched on a bit yesterday. Basically, systematic review is a way of treating a literature analysis more like an experiment, where you have methods, actually methods to help make sure that you're compiling evidence to match the question that you are asking. Also methods and approaches to sort of finding the potentially relevant literature, criteria to screen it for relevance, considerations for looking at individual study quality assessment, evidence synthesis approaches using structured frameworks. You're going to hear me talk about evidence synthesis within stream, and by that I mean within a human evidence stream, an animal evidence stream, a mechanistic evidence stream, which could include in vitro modeled animal data. And then evidence integration, which is really where you're trying to look across those different evidence streams and reach conclusions. Right now within the IRIS program, and I think probably across other programs to do this kind of work, it's qualitative. So at the end of this, you're going to come out with some sort of confidence assessment. We are interested, there is interest in trying to sort of think about more quantitative methods to do this. We have some people in my group who are working in Bayesian approaches, but that's really much more sort of a research phase. It's not something that's routinely implemented in actual assessments. In part, and I should back up, when I mentioned about the toxicity values, the reference dose, reference concentrations, the cancer values, so you have to think about the end user. I mean, they're programs and offices who you have to sort of defend them on their scientific merit, but also those values have to sort of withstand legal challenges. So, you know, they really, so in terms of trying to implement some of these more cutting edge approaches, there's a lot of relationship building and just sort of really walking people up to feeling comfortable with moving ahead. For the purposes, for the purpose of my talk, I'm going to focus on the areas of integration that I think are most relevant. So that would be sort of thinking about study evaluation, study quality evaluation, and then again approaches for trying to synthesize evidence within a stream and then across evidence streams. So in terms of individual study evaluation, it's a sort of the same approach for human and animal studies, and by that I mean sort of what we're really trying to look at is ultimately internal validity, risk of bias, sensitivity. So sensitivity might be in the context of a human epidemiology study. If there's few exposed cases, it's not going to have, that study is not going to be considered sensitive. You know, they can have fabulous methods to assess exposure, but if there's not a lot of variation in the exposure level, then they're not going to really have much of an exposure response range to interrogate. Applicability, this is sort of relevance, and I think this can be everything from, how relevant is an animal model or sort of a piece of mechanistic information, in this case to human health. I would say that our default is that animal models are considered directly relevant unless there's data to suggest otherwise. And I think that might be maybe a different default strategy than maybe in more of the clinical sciences, but in the environmental health, that's fairly standard. And then reporting quality. It's, again, what we're really trying to probe here is internal validity, but reporting quality, if a study is so poorly reported that you can't assess internal validity, then they become meshed together. So typically, study quality level assessments, it's domain-based, so that means numerical scoring systems have really fallen out of favor. So for animal, it might be things like, again, an aspect of reporting quality. If there might be deal breakers, some people don't report strains, specific forms of chemicals, and so that's the kind of thing that becomes a deal breaker. Selection or performance bias, this would get at things like, was there randomization? Again, the telling to, if you don't report it, then it's hard for us to assess it, and that usually doesn't fare well for the study. Reporting or attrition bias, I'm just going to sort of highlight a few. So that might be the way we would look at that is, you read the methods, and if things that seem like they were looked at in the methods aren't reported, then that raises a flag for selective reporting. Or if 20 animals were dosed in the methods and you're only seeing 11 accounted for in the results, and that's not discussed, and that raises a flag. Blinding at outcome assessment. On the epi side, fairly standard domains of exposure measurement, outcome assessment, selection, confounding, analysis, and sensitivity. In environmental health, I think that you can think about these as sort of unintentional interventions. So the exposures are pretty messy, and often in the epidemiology world, that's where we really struggle. So the practice would be that you would consider these domains, and that we typically have signaling questions that try to sort of pull out, and you can see this is sort of very expert-based. This is not something that sort of a junior person can do very easily. So you would have two people do this independently and then sort of reconcile their answers and come up with one rating. But you try to have signaling questions to sort of probe at the facts that help support some of the judgments. So you would make domain-specific judgments about good, adequate, poor, or critically deficient. And then it's possible that you do an overall study rating, and that can range from high to a study being considered uninformative because it has a number of critically deficient issues. So this is just a graphical representation. This is something from an epidemiology study example, but it would apply the same to animal. I think you probably gathered the more green, the better in this case. But something with a lot of the reds and the orange would be something that would probably be considered uninformative. Translation, it wouldn't be used in our analysis. We also look across study evaluations. So what you're seeing here is a lot of this is again sort of more the epidemiology domains, and then just sort of studies, and it's sort of this heat map where you get a sense of the general strength and weaknesses within a collection of studies. I should mention, as when we move into evidence synthesis and evidence integration, we are moving to looking at bodies, collections of studies. So that's why this kind of visual becomes helpful. In terms of evidence stream synthesis, so again, this would be sort of looking within the human, animal, mechanistic in certain cases. In most cases, when we have traditional evidence, the mechanistic information is more supportive. But again, as we move forward and we want to have an approach to dealing with the best available evidence, which may in certain cases only be mechanistic, then a lot of these concepts that I'm going to show you applied to human and animal could apply to modeled evidence, could apply to thinking about in vitro evidence. So evidence synthesis is more than just counting the number of positive and negative studies. You also have to think about the influence of bias and sensitivity. In our practice, if we have an abundance of studies, again, we would focus on those that were of medium or high confidence. The critically deficient would fall out. We may not use low if we have an abundance of better conducted studies. And we use a structured framework to aid in transparency of reaching these judgments. So the within evidence stream considerations, these are just sort of factors that you think about, and ultimately they're designed to get you at how confident are you in results from a collection of studies. So risk of bias, which is internal validity, sensitivity, the directness, applicability. This overlaps a lot with the Hill considerations, but there's been sort of over a period of time maybe an expansion on the Hill considerations, as well as more attempts to operationalize, like how do you judge consistency? So, and that's sort of the field that I work in. The magnitude of the effect, precision, biological gradient or dose response, and coherence, which might be in cases where you don't have apples and apples, but maybe if you're looking at thyroid and you have hormone measurements and thyroid hormone size and histopathology, and they're all pointing to something being affected, then that might be sort of a coherent pattern. Human and animal evidence is analyzed separately and then integrated across, and as I mentioned, mechanistic information is sort of brought in as it sort of informs, especially, it's usually more targeted if there's concerns about the biological plausibility, maybe the shape of the dose response at low doses. It's typically a more strategic use of mechanistic information. So when we think about, I guess one of the differences from thinking about doing systematic review in environmental health compared to more of a clinical realm is that our question is very, very broad. We have chemical, and we want to know what it's doing, and we're going to be looking at human studies, animal studies, mechanistic studies, without regard to health outcomes. So we have these very, very broad questions, and usually you do a screening where you identify studies that are relevant to that very, very broad question, and then you have to make some decisions as you're moving into evidence synthesis. At what level are you going to make your conclusions? Is it going to be at the level of male reproductive health, or is it going to be hypospadias? And it sort of depends on the extent and nature of the evidence. We also, as part of evidence synthesis, and this is really setting up to think about consistency, or something that would sort of downgrade your confidence is if you have really unexplained inconsistency. So a lot of these other factors are things that we think about when we're thinking about how to sort of stratify our evidence base, because we're looking at things that might be explainable sources of inconsistency. And that might be what populations were studied. Is it a general population? Occupational levels of exposure, which would be higher. What about differences from life stages or the duration of exposure? So these would just be features that we would think about when defining the collections of studies that we would reach conclusions on. And again, as I mentioned, we would reach within evidence stream judgments on human and animal information separately, and also sort of consider the mechanistic information typically in a more supportive fashion, and then integrate across all of those. So this is blank. Okay. All right. So this is just this is sort of a template that we give to our staff. So it's got a lot of words on it, but this is sort of an example of the structured framework I was talking about. And if you can see here, this is going to be sort of a confidence judgment about your human evidence. This is going to be a confidence judgment about your animal evidence, and then this is going to be sort of a confidence judgment about looking across those. So within an evidence stream, now you're talking about many of sort of those Hill considerations: consistency, effect size, indication of a dose or exposure gradient. Things that might downgrade your confidence would be unexplained inconsistency. And then there's typically a summary of findings. And then what these highlights in green, which you probably may or may not be able to read, would be sort of the places where right now the mechanistic information is being used to inform the judgments. And then here's just an example of, and this is just made up, this is not a real chemical. But here's just an example of, so here you have human evidence, and you can see that you only have 2 studies, a case series and a cross-sectional. If you get a sense from the colors on the risk of bias heat map, you see that there's a lot of oranges, there's some concerns there. And so this would be ultimately indeterminate, which basically we felt that we couldn't make a conclusion on it because there were few studies, there were a few exposed cases, we had concern about the quality of the studies. On the animal side, here would be a wider range of studies, so looking across rats and mice, different designs ranging from acute or subchronic to developmental, and you can sort of get a sense from the risk of bias heat map that there's a lot of greens there, so they're fairly well conducted. In this case, there was considered coherence among related endpoints, low risk of bias, evidence of dose response gradient in a number of studies, and indications of biological plausibility from the mechanistic information. And those would all increase our confidence. Some things that might decrease your confidence in this kind of evidence set would be sort of small sample size in some studies, and there was some unexplained inconsistency. And then you would typically have sort of a narrative or graphical presentation of the key results. And so in this case, the quality of the animal literature was considered moderate, and we looked across those because we had no reason to think that the animal model was irrelevant to humans, and there was sort of the support from the mechanistic information. The overall would be something like moderate, that there was potential for hazard. And I think just some parting thoughts So the state of the science for evidence integration across animal and human studies is largely qualitative. Structured frameworks like what I showed you are becoming more and more common. There's a lot of, what I just showed you is actually, believe it or not, sort of a method development application. The structured frameworks are most well established in sort of the clinical or healthcare realm where they're applied to human studies. So trying to apply those structured frameworks to animal information, to mechanistic, to modeled is a research method application. And then looking across those evidence stream is again sort of more of a method development place. In environmental health, chemical assessments, the animal models are typically assumed to be relevant unless there's data to suggest otherwise. And I think, I'm not sure if maybe some of the considerations for the importance of similarity in the animal and human responses might differ based on the goals, whether you're talking about a therapeutic predictivity versus identifying potential hazard. You know, so in our world, exact findings in animal and humans aren't necessarily required. So for example, to make a call for something about having a cancer potential, you don't necessarily require tumor site concordance. In that sense, the animal models can be sort of canaries in the coal mine. And I do think it's worth considering minimal data standards as journals develop guidance on the amount of type of information. As I saw you in terms of how published studies get used ultimately in decision making, features of not reporting things like randomization or blinding or just key basics of the chemical that was used can become deal breakers. And so obviously improving the quality of the reporting information makes it much easier to use this information. Okay. That's it.